I've been on a never-ending mission to remake all of my desktop icons in 3D, and today I'm moving on to things that don't have a desktop icon, but that I think should. As someone who's been playing Halo since I was literally like 11 years old, I had to do the Halo launcher. And obviously, the icon has to be the Master Chief helmet. Now, could I have modeled the entire helmet from scratch? Sure, but it would have taken forever. And remember, one of the recurring themes of this channel is, as 3D artists, if we can find resources for stuff, we should use them rather than making things out of whole cloth. But that doesn't mean I'm going to leave this model helmet exactly how I found it. I'm going to add some modeling just to add that little extra punch of detail. I started by cutting the helmet in half and getting rid of the triangular topology using tris to quads. And then I added a mirror modifier. That way I only have to do modeling on one side of the helmet, and that modeling will be automatically carried through to the other side. Then I started modeling in the lights on the side of the helmet just using a simple plane and simple primitives. If you've watched my other videos, one of the things that you'll start to notice over time is that I use most of the same modeling commands for most of the work that I do. I use bevel a ton, I use extrusion a ton obviously, and topology stuff is often handled through the knife tool and or through creating some messy topology and then cleaning it up. You'll also see me lean very heavily on what I was just doing, using loop tools to create circles out of insets. And Loop Tools has tons and tons of useful features. It's a free add-on. You can get it on the extension platform. I highly recommend doing that. But really, the reason I'm mentioning all this stuff is when you first start modeling, it's really, really daunting. The program itself has so many different interfaces, it can be really, really hard to understand even the basics of what you're doing. But what I want to do with these videos is demystify a lot of that and also just show through doing all of these different projects that despite many, many very different projects, the reality is that all modeling happens through the same few basic techniques. And once you learn those, you can model just about anything. With the modeling of those lights wrapped up, I went ahead and added a simple emission material to them and added a glare node in my compositor and enabled the real-time compositor so I can see that glare in viewport. I render all these animations in Eevee. It's gotten so good that it's almost indistinguishable from Cycles if it's set up correctly, and it's much faster to render. For the next little detail, I went ahead and added a Bezier curve and used the geometry settings in the curve to give it some thickness, then positioned it in the area that I inset into the helmet to add that sort of oxygen hose thing that runs along the side of the helmet. And the reason I chose to have this be a separate piece rather than just using the texture that was already included with this model is I think adding little details like this really makes the helmet look more realistic. It's the difference between a helmet that was designed for the game, which is prioritizing topological efficiency above all else, versus pushing that polygon count way up in favor of realism over mesh efficiency. And you can see here I'm making a simple hex bolt by adding a 6-sided circle, extruding it outward, subdividing the outer part, and then using the loop tool circle transform to transform that outer edge into a circle. That way I can just extrude it and I have a hex bolt set up super easily. And this is a technique I use all the time. If you have something that has a complex inner shape but a simple outer shape like a circle, instinctively you'd often try and work from the outer edge in, but the reality is it's actually often easier to model the complex inner shape first versus the simple outer shape, and then work your way outwards. Once I got the shape of the pipe how I wanted it, I went ahead and threw one of the materials from my material library on it, and I went and converted it from a curve to a mesh just so I could UV unwrap it and change the orientation of those UVs a little bit so the weave of this carbon fiber goes sort of at an angle to the overall shape of the UVs rather than aligned with them. One of the other tools I use all the time, and this one is not free, but I think it's absolutely worth the price if you are a industry professional or if you're making any money at all with Blender, is ZenUV. I am not sponsored by them or anything. I just use the tool enough that I can't stop recommending it, and it also makes UVing a breeze in Blender, which it certainly is not by default, although I do believe the devs are working on that. Then I went ahead and threw a mirror modifier on it and used the helmet as the centering object, and that way I have the pipe on both sides. Again, I like to use mirror modifiers for anything that's even remotely symmetrical because why would you do twice as much work when you can do half the work? Which actually reminds me of a little bit of a rant I wanted to go on, or maybe a discussion I wanted to start in the comments, depending on how you guys feel about this. But I see a lot of comments on my videos and on other videos about doing things the long way rather than the short way, especially when it comes to tips and tricks around Blender. If there's a tool or an add-on or whatever that makes the job easier and makes the result faster, people will say that doing it the long way, the tedious way, and often the worst way is better because when things take longer, that inherently makes them more artistic. I absolutely do not think this is the case. I think maybe this comes from people conflating this with AI, which is, of course, just putting in a prompt and getting a result. But in my view, it's not remotely the same thing, because if you are doing the faster way to model something, you still have 100% control over the art direction and process, whereas with AI, you have very little, if any, control over any of that stuff. But I'm curious to see what you guys think. Is it better to do something the slow way, even if you get exactly the same result, inherently just because it takes longer? Let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, rant over. For the actual animation when the icons clicked, I wanted to recreate the shield recharge effect from the Halo games that happens when you get enough hits that your shield goes away. And to do that, I had to recreate the sort of Spartan shield around the helmet itself. And I started by making a duplicate of the helmet mesh and simplifying it so that I could have a shield material on it. And I had a little bit of an idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to combine a geometry nodes lightning system that I'd used a few times before with a custom shader node setup that would allow me to basically control what parts of the shield were visible using a single control object. And that I've done some parts of, but I haven't done the whole thing before. And I wanted to challenge myself because, remember, one of the mottos of this channel is never stop learning. And I have found throughout my entire career that challenging yourself to do things that you've never done before is one of the best ways to do that continuous learning. But how do you guarantee you get the outcome that you want and you actually learn something from the challenge? Personally, I think structured courses offer some of the best outcomes when you're trying to do this type of continuous learning. And that's why I've partnered with Brilliant. Brilliant is not just the sponsor of today's video, it is a learning app that helps you get smarter every day. It has thousands of interactive lessons in math, science, programming, and more. I personally think Brilliant is, well, brilliant, because they go out of their way to help you actually develop problem-solving skills rather than just memorizing solutions. One of the things that I really appreciate about Brilliant is that it takes these complex topics like math, science, and more and structures them into small bite-sized pieces so that you can form a habit of learning a little bit of your topic every single day. And I think that's essential for conquering something as complicated as programming. And that's great, because that's exactly what I'm doing with it. See, while I've worked as a Python developer using Blender before, most of my roles have been art-focused. And what I really want to do is develop a foundational understanding of how this stuff actually works so I can feel comfortable using it. And Brilliant is helping me develop that intuition for the actual logic the computer uses and get a really deep understanding of Python, far beyond what I had before I tried it. So if you want to take a deep dive into math, science, or programming like me, you could try out everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days if you go to my link, brilliant.org/bytedozer, or you can scan the QR code that I've put on screen here, or I'll also put a link in the description below. And on top of that, if you sign up with that link, you'll also get 20% off their annual premium subscription. So if you're like me and you're always trying to learn new stuff, definitely give Brilliant a try. Now it was time for me to move on to one of the more complicated parts of the shield, the spark effect. And for the sparks, I'm using the Spark Generator by Cartesian Camel as a base, and I believe that's available on Blender Market. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, I just have used this tool multiple times and I think it's pretty cool. It's essentially a simple geometry node setup, and I'm just modifying the settings by adding a bunch more sparks and taking the amount of offset down so that they sit closer to the helmet. And the material changes that I'm going to make are really where the magic of this will happen. The core of my material setup for all the different components of the shield that I'm going to make is going to be a simple but very powerful setup that I use all the time, which is a texture coordinate node with an associated empty as a control object, and you can set that by using the object eyedropper or using the dropdown to pick from your various objects. I created an empty to use as mine. That's going to be passed into a mapping node so that I can control the location of my gradient texture, and that's going to be plugged into the vector input of a gradient texture, which I'm just going to pass through a color ramp so that I can control the width and breadth and blend of the gradient texture. And that's going to let me basically have this positionable gradient that I can use as a mask to control what parts of the different materials are visible. And the actual core of the material itself will be very, very simple. It's going to be the emissive that I have already created, along with a transparency and a mix shader. And the output of our controlled color ramp gradient is just going to go right into the input of the mix shader. Of course, just like plugging in a USB stick, every single time I do this, I wire it backwards. So I had to unplug the emission and the transparency and reverse them. But now with the setup correct, I can use this empty and its scale, position, and motion to control what parts of my lightning are visible and what aren't. And I'm going to take that concept and I'm going to apply it to the overall overshield and also to some little streak effects that I'm going to add next to it. For the main part of the shield, I used the exact same setup, but I mixed in a wave texture along with another gradient so I could control it. And I used the initial gradient, the one that actually controls the visibility, as the mix factor for a color node that is blending between my gradient texture and pure black. And basically what that lets me do is set the visibility of just the wave texture in the specific area that the empty is controlling. And that creates this cool sort of wavy shield recharge effect when I move my empty controller up and down past the shield. And then I went ahead and messed around with the phase and detail a little bit just to make those waves a little bit more interesting. I also added a couple single keyframes to some of the different properties on the wave texture and added a noise modifier to them in the F-curve editor. And that lets me just sort of have the waves randomly move themselves around a little bit as the shield is moving around. And I think it makes it look a little bit more dynamic and closer to the original. And for the streaks around the shield, I created some very simple mesh diamonds and just changed the scale somewhat randomly and positioned them in places that I thought looked interesting and dynamic around the shield. And I joined them all as one object and just applied a simple gradient material with the exact same control type as the lightning and as the waves, just using that same gradient so that moving my object controls all three of these materials at once. Now, thanks to all the work that I put into basically creating a rig for the material controller, I was able to animate it simply by doing a simple animation, passing the controller through the helmet a few times to create the hits, expanding the controller inside of the helmet to create the shield overloading and popping off effect, and then keying the controller down, expanding it outward, and animating it up to create the shield recharge effect. Super simple. I'm a big believer in creating simple but powerful rigs over just hand keying everything because you get much better results and you end up doing less work. And this is what the final result looks like. And that's it for this one, which means it's time for me to shill myself a little bit. If you want to support what I'm doing here and support my ability to make more videos, you can do that by subscribing. If you really want to support it extra, you can either join my Patreon or my YouTube membership. Don't do both, it's the same thing. It's just a preference on which platform you prefer. And if you do that, you'll get a few extra perks, including a bunch of behind the scenes content, uncut videos of how I do all this stuff, along with blend files of the actual projects themselves, and various assets that I've created throughout the course of making videos. I'll catch you on the next one, and remember, never stop learning.